The smirk of Sheriff Bart in Blazing Saddles captivated America. Audiences saw a hyper-masculine ladies' man effortlessly shattering racial stereotypes. But it was a flawless deception. The moment the director called cut, the on-screen hero became a silent prisoner. It was widely understood by industry insiders that Cleavon Little was gay. Yet to protect their financial investments, the Hollywood machinery forced him to play the straight leading man long after he left the set. This mandate turned his reality into a prison of absolute paranoia. The man who conquered systemic barriers on film had to bury his true identity, living in daily terror of exposure, just to survive a cold-blooded system ready to permanently erase him if his secret ever leaked. Born on June 1, 1939 in Chickasha, Oklahoma, Little entered a fundamentally segregated America. However, his trajectory was not defined by the rural South, but by the great migrations westward. His family relocated to San Diego, California, during his childhood. In the post-Depression, post-World War II era, Southern California represented a tenuous promise of mobility for Black Americans, but it required strict adherence to an unspoken set of social rules. For the upwardly mobile Black family in the mid-20th century, survival and advancement were heavily reliant on the politics of respectability. This was a rigid sociological survival tactic. To counter the violent and pervasive racial caricatures prevalent in American society, Black individuals were expected to project an image of absolute flawlessness. Every public action, every spoken sentence, and every sartorial choice was scrutinized. Excellence was not merely an ambition, it was a mandate for basic safety and economic viability. Little absorbed this mandate completely. He did not conform to the street-hardened narratives that white casting directors would later expect from Black actors in the 1970s. Instead, he built an impenetrable foundation of academic and linguistic rigor. He attended San Diego City College and later transferred to San Diego State University. His chosen field of study was highly specific and deeply revealing. He earned a bachelor's degree in speech therapy. This academic choice was profound. Little did not just learn to speak well, he studied the anatomical and psychological mechanics of human communication. In an era where a Black man's dialect could instantly disqualify him from employment or basic societal respect, mastering standard American diction was a powerful defensive weapon. He learned how to manipulate cadence, tone, and pronunciation to assimilate, project authority, and disarm prejudice. This training in speech therapy effectively served as his first masterclass in acting. It taught him the mechanics of building a persona from the vocal cords outward. He learned that if he controlled the narrative voice, he could control how the white establishment perceived him. By the mid-1960s, armed with this academic armor, Little moved to New York City to pursue classical theater. He enrolled in the prestigious American Academy of Dramatic Arts, AADA. The AADA was a grueling, highly competitive crucible that demanded intense discipline. For Little, the theater offered a unique psychological sanctuary. On stage, he was explicitly directed to inhabit other identities. The very nature of classical acting provided him with a legitimate, celebrated reason to hide in plain sight. He could process complex emotions, project power, and command a room, all while remaining shielded behind the text of a playwright. His talent was undeniable. In 1967, he graduated from the AADA and was awarded the institution's highest honor, the American Academy Award for Best Actor. This accolade validated his strategy. The establishment was rewarding him for his flawless execution of characters. The culmination of this foundational period occurred in 1970 when Little took the Broadway stage in the musical Purlie. Playing the titular role of Purlie Victorious Judson, a fast-talking, charismatic traveling preacher attempting to reclaim an inheritance from a tyrannical plantation owner, Little was a revelation. The role required a delicate balance of biting satire, sheer physical energy, and undeniable magnetism. He navigated the racial politics of the play with a razor-sharp comedic timing that left critics and audiences astounded. His performance in Purlie won him the Tony Award for Best Actor in a Musical, as well as the Drama Desk Award. At 31 years old, Cleavon Little had conquered Broadway. He had proven that a black man with rigorous classical training could dominate the highest echelons of American theater. Following the triumph of Purlie, Little did not immediately surrender to the Hollywood executives. His initial foray into cinema was deeply subversive. In the 1971 existential cult film Vanishing Point, he delivered a mesmerizing performance as Super Soul, a blind visionary radio DJ who acts as a Greek chorus for a fractured America. The role required no physical action. It relied entirely on the hypnotic cadence and emotional authority of his voice. It was the ultimate vindication of his rigorous speech therapy training. He proved he could anchor a film and command an audience using nothing but his vocal mastery. This early cinematic victory indicated a limitless potential for complex, dramatic leading roles, a potential that the corporate machinery of the mid-1970s would deliberately choose to ignore in favor of marketable caricatures. Yet this monumental success cemented a dangerous psychological precedent. The Tony Award was proof that his meticulously constructed exterior, the educated, charming, impeccably spoken, and safely masculine black star, was highly lucrative. The stage had taught him how to build a golden armor, and the industry had just paid handsomely for it. He was universally celebrated, but the man receiving the applause was a carefully curated projection. As he prepared to transition from the intellectual haven of Broadway to the ruthless, commerce-driven machinery of Hollywood, that golden armor was about to become a permanent, suffocating cage. The foundation of respectability had been perfectly laid, setting the stage for a decades-long performance that would exact a devastating internal toll. When Cleavon Little transitioned from the intellectual, insulated environment of New York theater to the sun-baked, hyper-commercialized landscape of 1970s Los Angeles, he encountered an entirely different industrial beast. Broadway respected craft, Hollywood demanded a marketable commodity. The film industry during this decade was undergoing a seismic cultural shift, particularly regarding race. The early 1970s marked the explosion of the blaxploitation genre. Studios realized there was massive capital to be extracted from black audiences, resulting in a wave of films featuring hyper-aggressive, street-smart, heavily armed black male leads. Characters like Shaft and Superfly dominated the cultural zeitgeist. To fully grasp Little's isolation during this era, one must examine the grim financial architecture of the early 1970s studio system. Traditional Hollywood was teetering on the edge of total bankruptcy. Massive, bloated musicals had failed spectacularly at the box office, and executives were desperate for liquidity. The sudden, explosive success of independent black cinema revealed a vast, fiercely loyal, and entirely untapped demographic: the urban black moviegoer. In an act of predatory corporate pivot, major studios immediately co-opted this movement, rapidly mass-producing low-budget, high-yield action films designed exclusively to extract capital from black neighborhoods to save white-owned studios. The industry was not interested in elevating black artistry. They were executing a financial rescue operation. In this ruthless assembly line environment, a highly educated theater-trained actor like Little was practically useless to the corporate bottom line. He offered nuance to a machine that was actively printing money off of sensationalism. Little, with his meticulous speech therapy background, Tony-winning pedigree, and refined demeanor, fundamentally did not fit this new, highly lucrative stereotype. He was too polished for blaxploitation, yet mainstream white Hollywood was still largely unwilling to cast a black man in a traditional, non-racialized leading role. He was caught in an industry blind spot. However, his theater background gave him a distinct advantage in the eyes of corporate executives. He was perceived as manageable. This dynamic came to a head during the casting of the 1974 satirical western, Blazing Saddles. Director Mel Brooks originally co-wrote the film with, and explicitly for, the incendiary comedian Richard Pryor. Pryor was the raw, unfiltered voice of black comedy at the time. However, the executives at Warner Brothers flatly refused to greenlight Pryor for the lead role of Sheriff Bart. Pryor's well-documented substance abuse and unpredictable public behavior made him uninsurable in the eyes of the studio's risk management departments. Warner Brothers demanded a reliable, highly trained, and most importantly, safe alternative. Cleavon Little was the perfect corporate solution. He possessed the comedic timing required by the script, but he delivered it with a classical polish that did not genuinely threaten the white executives signing the checks. However, securing the role of Sheriff Bart placed Little in an agonizing psychological crucible on the actual set of Blazing Saddles. The script was a minefield of hyper-aggressive racial slurs and deeply offensive historical caricatures. While the film's ultimate objective was to satirize white supremacy, the daily emotional labor of executing that satire fell disproportionately on Little's shoulders. He was the solitary black lead navigating a predominantly white production environment. Every day, he was required to process the visceral sting of the dialogue, internalize the racial hostility directed at his character, and instantly transmute that trauma into effortless, charming physical comedy. He had to absorb the poison and smile through it. This required a level of psychological compartmentalization that bordered on the superhuman. He was effectively tasked with managing the racial anxieties of both the white crew on set and the eventual white audience in the theaters, ensuring that the heavy racial themes remained palatable and endlessly entertaining. It was a masterclass in performative survival, masking a deeply isolating on-set reality. Taking the role of Sheriff Bart secured Little's place in cinematic history, but it simultaneously initiated a rigid, inescapable public relations strategy. The character of Bart was explicitly written as a suave, heteronormative ladies' man. A significant portion of the film's humor and its subsequent marketing relied on Bart's potent, unquestioned masculine sexuality, famously culminating in the seduction of Madeline Kahn's character Lily von Stupp. To sell the movie, Warner Brothers needed to sell Cleavon Little as a mainstream heterosexual sex symbol. This marketing imperative clashed violently with Little's private reality. In 1974, Hollywood operated under an ironclad system of compulsory heterosexuality. Studio contracts still contained aggressively enforced morality clauses. These legal stipulations gave studios the unilateral right to terminate employment and sever all financial ties if an actor was involved in conduct deemed scandalous or morally reprehensible by the general public. In the 1970s, homosexuality was not merely a scandal, it was a career-ending offense. It was widely understood in the entertainment sector that if a leading man was outed, his box office viability in Middle America would instantly evaporate. For a black actor whose opportunities were already severely restricted by systemic racism, the margin for error was exactly zero. To navigate this treacherous landscape, actors operating outside the heterosexual norm frequently relied on established industry crisis management tactics. One of the most common and effective shields was the marriage of convenience. In 1972, exactly as his mainstream film and television career was gaining crucial momentum leading up to Blazing Saddles, Little married a woman named Valerie Wiggins. While the precise internal emotional mechanics of their relationship remain private, industry historians and those familiar with the era's studio protocols note the highly strategic timing of the union. The marriage provided Little with an immediate, undeniable layer of PR armor. When a reporter asked about his personal life, or when studio publicists needed to craft a biography for press kits, the existence of a wife neutralized any dangerous speculation. It constructed a solid, respectable, heterosexual firewall around his private life. The marriage lasted until 1974, ending in divorce the exact same year Blazing Saddles hit theaters and solidified his global stardom. The timing of this dissolution is critical to understanding the Hollywood machinery. Once the film was released and his status as a leading man was temporarily secured, the immediate pressing utility of the marriage may have run its course, or the psychological strain of maintaining the facade became unsustainable. Regardless of the specific catalyst, the 2-year marriage successfully guided him through his most vulnerable career transition, establishing a public record of heterosexuality that he would lean on for the rest of his life. Yet the corporate mandate for a beard remained a permanent, exhausting fixture long after the divorce papers were signed. Red carpets, press junkets, and award ceremonies demanded a mechanical pantomime, rehearsed smiles with studio-approved starlets, manufactured chemistry for the cameras, followed by completely separate cars home. It was not merely a strategic PR maneuver, it was a recurring public humiliation, a daily visceral reminder that the studios viewed his actual, authentic identity as a monstrous liability, requiring relentless, heavily orchestrated camouflage. Maintaining this straight illusion was a relentless, exhausting daily exercise. During the massive press junkets for Blazing Saddles, Little had to perform in a secondary role, that of the conventional Hollywood bachelor. He gave interviews detailing his leading man charm, smiled for photographs with female co-stars designed to imply off-screen chemistry, and carefully navigated the intrusive questions of talk show hosts. Every public interaction was a calculated maneuver to ensure the corporate machinery continued to view him as a viable, safe investment. However, the immense financial success of Blazing Saddles revealed the ultimate hypocrisy of the Hollywood system. Little had played their game flawlessly. He had delivered a blockbuster performance, adhered to the PR mandates, and successfully masked his private life. By the traditional rules of the industry, he should have been rewarded with his pick of major leading roles. Instead, the doors slammed shut. Corporate Hollywood did not view Sheriff Bart as proof of Little's expansive range. They viewed it as a highly specific, unrepeatable novelty. Because he refused to pivot into the demeaning caricatures that populated lesser comedies, and because the industry was fundamentally incapable of envisioning a black classically trained actor as a standard romantic lead in a drama, he was sidelined. The machinery had extracted the exact performance it needed to generate a massive profit. Once the box office receipts were counted, they had no further use for him. The illusion had been successfully maintained, but the reward was professional stagnation, leaving Little isolated in a town that demanded his total conformity, but offered him no long-term loyalty in return. When the promotional tours concluded and the studio lots emptied, Cleavon Little did not simply go home. He entered a highly structured parallel reality. For a globally recognized leading man harboring a marginalized sexual identity in the 1970s and 1980s, the closet was not a passive state of being. It was a grueling, active, and permanent logistical operation. Navigating the hidden ecosystem of Los Angeles and New York required the tactical precision of an intelligence asset operating in hostile territory. The physical geography of this hidden world was strictly demarcated. A star of Little's caliber could not casually patronize the burgeoning post-Stonewall public establishments. Walking into a known gay bar in West Hollywood or a public club in Greenwich Village was an unacceptable risk, guaranteed to trigger a catastrophic cascade of gossip. Instead, survival depended on accessing a shadowy, heavily fortified infrastructure built entirely on closed doors, unlisted addresses, and extreme vetting. This underground architecture operated on two distinct coasts, each with its own operational hazards. In New York, where Little retained strong theatrical ties, the sanctuary often took the form of private, membership-only loft parties or subterranean clubs that operated after hours. Access to these spaces required a physical key or a personal vouch from a high-ranking member of the nightlife hierarchy. In Los Angeles, the ecosystem was spread across the sprawling, isolated geography of the Hollywood Hills. Industry insiders from the era note that wealthy, closeted executives and established stars would host discreet gatherings in fortified canyon estates. These properties were specifically chosen for their long gated driveways and high retaining walls, designed to block the sight lines of telephoto lenses. Attending these gatherings was never as simple as driving to a location. The choreography of movement was highly complex. It was widely understood in their inner circle that high-profile figures frequently utilized decoy vehicles, staggered arrival times, and relied on trusted fixers to rent cars under assumed corporate aliases. Some employed off-duty law enforcement officers, paid exorbitantly for their absolute silence, to act as drivers and physical buffers. The objective was to ensure that the public face of the actor was never geographically linked to the private sanctuary. This necessity for constant covert movement meant that the simple act of seeking community required hours of exhausting premeditation. This physical isolation was brutally compounded by the systemic racial divisions that plagued both mainstream America and the underground itself. The established gay rights movement of the 1970s and the physical spaces it controlled were overwhelmingly white and frequently hostile to outsiders. Black patrons at prominent white-owned clubs routinely faced discriminatory entry policies, such as arbitrary demands for multiple forms of identification or sudden enforcements of vague dress codes. Conversely, seeking refuge within the black queer underground carried equally severe risks. These communities were often deeply embedded in specific tight-knit neighborhoods or the underground ballroom scene. For a famous, recognizable Hollywood actor to enter these highly localized spaces was to become a glaring anomaly, drawing dangerous attention. Caught between a white underground that often rejected him and a black community where his presence was too conspicuous to remain hidden, a black, same-sex attracted public figure was forced into a state of perpetual exile. There was virtually no physical location where they could safely lower their defenses. The necessity of this PR armor was driven by a terrifying evolution in celebrity journalism. The 1970s saw the rapid decline of the old studio system, which previously held absolute control over what the press published. In its place rose a new, aggressive breed of freelance tabloid paparazzi. Armed with advancements in fast-speed film and powerful telephoto lenses, these photographers were no longer dependent on studio access. They became independent bounty hunters. The financial incentives were staggering. A single, undeniable photograph proving a major star's homosexuality could be sold to publications like the National Enquirer for tens of thousands of dollars. This technological shift turned the daily life of a closeted star into a permanent surveillance state. The paranoia was absolute and entirely justified. Every public space, from a restaurant patio to an airport terminal, had to be instantly scanned for potential threats. The hypervigilance required to constantly monitor sightlines and assess the motivations of strangers meant that his nervous system was perpetually locked in a state of fight or flight. This sheer cognitive load, managing a complex matrix of lies, secret identities, and constant physical surveillance, was catastrophic. He had to maintain an ironclad mental ledger, tracking exactly which version of his persona had been presented to which studio executive or casual acquaintance. Knowing a single dropped pronoun could trigger a fatal unraveling of his entire empire. This harrowing compartmentalization followed him directly into the casting rooms. Every pitch meeting and contract negotiation was heavily shadowed by an unspoken terror. Actors in his position were acutely aware that the men sitting across the desk held the power to destroy them. The threat was baked into the subtext of every interaction, forcing artists to accept subpar material and reduced billing, knowing that any attempt to assert their worth could trigger a retaliation that would end their careers permanently. This threat matrix extended directly into the actor's own home, fundamentally corrupting the nature of their entourage. For a marginalized star, an assistant, a manager, or a housekeeper was not just an employee. They were a potential informant holding a live grenade. The vetting process for hiring personal staff was a grueling exercise in risk management. Non-disclosure agreements were strictly enforced, but legal documents offered little comfort against a tabloid payout that dwarfed an employee's annual salary. Trust became an unaffordable luxury. High-profile individuals were forced to compartmentalize their own households, locking doors within their own homes, securing private phone lines, and restricting staff access to specific areas to prevent the accidental discovery of a partner or a piece of correspondence. The home, theoretically the ultimate sanctuary, was often just another compromised perimeter that required constant management. Furthermore, the underground ecosystem operated alongside a quiet, booming extortion economy. The threat of blackmail was a daily reality for those who had something to lose. Extortion in this era rarely resembled a cinematic ransom drop. It was often insidious and bureaucratic. It manifested as loans to distant acquaintances that could never be called in, or jobs demanded for unqualified individuals who hinted they knew something about a specific weekend in Palm Springs. Marginalized talents slowly bled their own finances to maintain the silence of an expanding circle of liabilities. They were essentially paying a permanent tax on their own existence. The transition from the cultural experimentation of the 1970s into the rigid conservatism of the 1980s fundamentally altered the power structure within the American entertainment industry. As the political landscape shifted under the Reagan administration and the moral majority gained formidable cultural influence, Hollywood executives aggressively recalibrated their risk tolerance. The studios transformed from risk-taking creative hubs into highly fortified corporate entities, focused exclusively on securing mass-market demographics. In this newly sanitized economic environment, any deviation from strict traditional family values was no longer viewed merely as a PR headache. It was categorized as a direct financial threat to corporate shareholders. For an actor harboring a hidden identity, the power dynamics shifted from a game of hide and seek to a ruthless, high-stakes hostage situation where the executives held all the leverage. This shift manifested most insidiously through the weaponization of the Hollywood Whisper network. Unlike the formal documented blacklists of the McCarthy era, this new system of professional suppression left no paper trail. It operated entirely through closed-door meetings, unspoken agreements among casting directors, and implicit warnings exchanged between talent agencies. If an actor was flagged by this network as a potential liability due to unconfirmed rumors regarding their sexuality, they were quietly and systematically starved of opportunity. A-list scripts simply stopped arriving. Audition requests evaporated. This silent attrition was legally fortified by a vicious resurgence of the 1930s standard morality clause. These stipulations were purposefully written with extreme ambiguity, allowing studios to unilaterally void multi-year deals and demand the return of advance payments if an actor committed any act bringing them into public disrepute. In this conservative climate, the mere unverified accusation of homosexuality was legally sufficient to plunge an actor into sudden financial ruin. Furthermore, the application of this weaponized system was profoundly inequitable, shaped heavily by the systemic racial hierarchy of the era. If a bankable white leading man faced such rumors, the studio apparatus would frequently intervene to protect their investment, deploying aggressive PR teams and cover stories. However, for a black actor like Cleavon Little, this protective infrastructure did not exist. The industry had already designated black talent as largely expendable. When caught in the crosshairs of the Whisper network, he was deemed a high-risk, low-reward asset and was promptly abandoned. This abandonment forced actors into highly toxic relationships with their own representatives. Managers and agents transformed into enforcers of the system's grip. An agent who knew a client's secret possessed an extraordinary amount of unchecked power. The professional relationship was not a partnership, but an extortionate negotiation held at gunpoint, keeping marginalized talent under strict exploitative control. The practical reality of this systemic grip on Cleavon Little's career was stark and measurable. Following his peak in the mid-1970s, a performer of his proven caliber, equipped with a Tony Award and a massive box office hit, should have been anchored as a recurring leading man in major theatrical releases. Instead, he was relegated to a grueling circuit of single-week guest spots on shows like The Love Boat, Fantasy Island, ALF, and MacGyver. The networks had found a cynical, highly profitable compromise. They could still rent his Tony-winning charisma and recognizable face for a quick ratings bump, while completely insulating themselves from the perceived PR risks of actually anchoring a series around him. The financial mechanics of this guest star purgatory were inherently exploitative. By refusing to cast him as a series regular, the networks effectively severed him from the most lucrative aspect of television acting, back-end residuals, and long-term syndication royalties. Instead, Little was trapped in a grueling gig economy cycle before the term even existed. He was paid a flat, heavily capped episodic rate. The networks utilized his Tony-winning prestige and massive cinematic recognition to legitimize their sitcoms and boost their weekly Nielsen ratings, while absorbing absolutely zero long-term financial liability for his career. Furthermore, the roles themselves were often creatively bankrupt. He was frequently parachuted into aggressively white suburban sitcoms to act as a momentary urban disruption, a tokenized injection of flavor meant to be neatly resolved by the final commercial break. Watching a classically trained titan of the stage continually play second fiddle to animatronic puppets in superficial primetime soap operas was not just a tragic misallocation of talent, it was a deliberate, structural containment of a black artist deemed too complex and too dangerous to lead. As the decade progressed, this corporate paranoia began to intersect with a rapidly emerging public health catastrophe. The whispers in executive boardrooms were no longer solely focused on the moral implications of an actor's private life or the threat of an advertiser boycott. By the early 1980s, the power dynamics shifted to incorporate a primal, heavily stigmatized fear of disease. The system was gearing up to use this new crisis not just as a reason to sideline marginalized talent, but as a mechanism for total, unforgiving erasure. The grip was tightening, and the cost of maintaining the required public illusion was about to become a matter of physical survival. The human body is fundamentally unequipped to sustain a permanent state of psychological warfare. For Cleavon Little, the requirement to project an unyielding, safely heteronormative exterior while navigating a deeply stigmatized internal reality was not merely an emotional burden, it was a grueling biological marathon. Clinical psychology dictates that living a compartmentalized, deeply closeted life requires a relentless suppression of natural impulses, forcing the nervous system into a chronic state of hyperarousal. The brain perceives the constant threat of social and professional exposure as a literal threat to survival, triggering an unbroken release of cortisol and adrenaline. Over the span of decades, this relentless neurochemical flooding erodes the physical infrastructure of the body. The toll of this hidden existence manifested in a profound physical exhaustion that dictated the latter half of Little's life. In the high-pressure environment of the 1980s entertainment industry, performers subjected to this specific brand of neurological distress typically sought a form of anesthesia to numb the friction between their public mask and their private truth. While Hollywood during this era was notoriously awash in illicit substances, providing an easily accessible, albeit destructive, escape valve for many executives and stars, the primary anesthesia utilized by marginalized professionals often took a different, quieter form. For those who could not afford the public spectacle of a stint in a rehabilitation facility, because a breakdown would inevitably lead to questions that could unearth their closely guarded secrets, the coping mechanism of choice was severe emotional withdrawal and an obsessive retreat into the craft itself. Little utilized the camera and the stage not just as a profession, but as a heavily fortified psychological bunker. Work became the anesthesia. Industry colleagues observed a man who became increasingly guarded off camera, retreating into a protective shell of silence the moment a scene wrapped. This intense isolation was a defensive perimeter. By minimizing unscripted interpersonal contact, he minimized the risk of an accidental disclosure. However, this strategy of aggressive self-isolation created a devastating feedback loop. The very mechanism he used to protect his livelihood stripped him of the necessary grounding human connections required to process the trauma of his daily existence. He was essentially locking himself in a sensory deprivation tank of his own making, trading his psychological well-being for professional survival. This internal deterioration collided catastrophically with the defining public health nightmare of the late 20th century. By the early to mid-1980s, the arrival of the HIV/AIDS epidemic fundamentally transformed the landscape of the underground ecosystem. What had previously been a covert sanctuary for the marginalized morphed almost overnight into an epicenter of profound medical terror. The disease decimated the hidden networks of Los Angeles and New York. The coded language and discrete gatherings that once facilitated connection were suddenly replaced by the grim realities of unexplained illnesses, sudden disappearances, and funerals that industry colleagues were explicitly warned not to attend. For a closeted actor in Hollywood, the virus escalated the stakes from the threat of professional ruin to the immediate threat of a terrifying, highly stigmatized death. The industry's corporate response to the epidemic was characterized by ruthless self-preservation and institutionalized cruelty. Studio executives, driven by panic and a desperate need to protect their financial investments, quietly instituted rigorous, highly invasive medical screening protocols. Insurance companies, underwriting major film productions, began demanding comprehensive blood panels to silently weed out anyone suspected of carrying the virus or engaging in high-risk lifestyles. This created an atmosphere of unprecedented, suffocating terror. A sudden weight loss, a persistent cough, or a minor skin blemish was no longer a private medical issue. It was a potential red flag that could result in an actor being quietly blacklisted by studio risk assessment departments. The mandate from the top was absolute terrified silence. Caught in this suffocating grip, unable to speak out about the decimation of the community he privately inhabited, Little began to weaponize his filmography. If he could not advocate for himself or his community in the press, he would smuggle his reality onto the screen. This marked a profound shift in his career trajectory, moving from broad commercial comedies into highly specific subversive character work that operated as a silent protest. The first notable instance of this subversion occurred in 1985 with his supporting role in the horror comedy Once Bitten. In a cinematic landscape dominated by aggressive traditional action heroes, Little deliberately chose to play a proud, openly gay vampire. On the surface, the studio marketed the role as broad, campy satire. However, looking through the lens of the era's oppressive climate, his performance was a calculated act of defiance. He took a caricature designed for cheap laughs and injected it with an undeniable defiant dignity. He was standing in front of a mainstream audience, embodying a marginalized identity and daring the Hollywood machinery to stop him. It was a pressure release valve, a momentary drop of the mask hidden within the confines of a genre film. This strategy of cinematic confession reached its absolute zenith in 1989. Little accepted a guest starring role on the NBC sitcom Dear John, a show centered around a support group for divorced and vulnerable individuals. In the episode titled Stand By Your Man, Little played Tony Larkin, a man who joins the support group while grappling with the overwhelming burden of hiding his homosexuality. The parallels between the character of Tony Larkin and the actual life of Cleavon Little were staggering, transforming the sitcom episode into a devastating piece of meta-narrative. The script required Little to deliver monologues detailing the exact psychological torment he had privately endured for decades. He spoke directly to the camera about the exhaustion of living a double life, the terror of public exposure, and the profound isolating loneliness of deceiving the people around him to maintain a facade of acceptable masculinity. When Little performed these scenes, the clinical detachment required for traditional acting vanished. The raw, unfiltered anguish he projected was not the result of a performer researching a fictional trauma. It was the visceral release of a man who had been suffocating under the weight of an industry mandate for over 20 years. He was broadcasting a highly classified confession across national television networks, shielded only by the plausible deniability that he was simply reading lines from a script. The performance was so unvarnished, so undeniably grounded in authentic pain, that it shattered the typical tonal constraints of a 1980s sitcom. The Television Academy recognized the seismic impact of this work, awarding him the Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Guest Actor in a Comedy Series. Yet the tragedy of the accolade was unavoidable. The industry was publicly rewarding him with a gold statue for finally articulating the exact psychological agony that their corporate policies had forced him to endure in silence. He was celebrated for his honesty only because it was securely packaged within the safe fictional confines of a 30-minute television broadcast. Even as his physiological decline accelerated, Little actively utilized his remaining stamina to reframe his cinematic legacy. Refusing to let his final act be defined solely by the trivializing guest spots of the previous decade, he sought out projects with profound historical gravity. In 1991, he secured a pivotal role in the landmark television docudrama Separate but Equal, acting alongside the formidable Sidney Poitier to chronicle the legal eradication of segregated schooling in America. This was a highly deliberate, protective maneuver. By anchoring his failing physical presence to a narrative of monumental black resilience and systemic defiance, he was essentially writing his own closing argument. It was a final, dignified assertion of his intellectual weight, executed just as the industry and his own biology were preparing to silence him permanently. As the 1990s commenced, the cumulative physical toll of a lifetime spent navigating Hollywood's rigid expectations culminated in a profound physiological decline. Cleavon Little, sensing the rapid deterioration of his health, initiated a severe and deliberate withdrawal from the public eye. The social isolation that had previously functioned as a tactical public relations strategy now became a strict medical necessity. He restricted his inner circle almost exclusively to his daughter, immediate family members, and a highly vetted roster of trusted long-term colleagues. This defensive posture was essential for professional survival. In the entertainment industry of the early 1990s, illness was not viewed as a human vulnerability. It was categorized by studio executives and insurance actuaries as a severe financial liability. A sick actor was an uninsurable asset. To maintain his livelihood and fulfill his remaining television contracts, Little had to project vitality while his body quietly failed. The grueling reality of this final performance required immense stamina. He continued to accept guest-starring television roles, utilizing heavy stage makeup, tailored wardrobe adjustments, and carefully negotiated shooting schedules to mask severe weight loss and chronic physical exhaustion from production crews. He was executing a complex, double-layered deception, continuing to hide his private life from the press, while simultaneously hiding his mortality from his employers. The clinical reality was unforgiving. Little was privately battling advanced aggressive colon cancer. He navigated the grueling regimen of medical treatments with the same intense operational secrecy that characterized his underground social life decades prior. Medical appointments were scheduled under assumed aliases. Hospital visits were coordinated through private, unmonitored service entrances. He fought the disease in near total silence, explicitly denying the industry the opportunity to pity him or prematurely write his professional obituary. On October 22, 1992, this final exhausting performance concluded. Cleavon Little died at his home in Sherman Oaks, California, at the age of 53. The official statements released by his representatives, which were firmly corroborated by his medical records and attending physicians, confirmed the direct cause of death as colon cancer. However, the specific timing of his passing triggered an immediate and vicious reaction from the tabloid media complex. The year 1992 was the absolute epicenter of the HIV/AIDS panic in the United States. The virus had thoroughly decimated the entertainment industry, and a deeply entrenched, highly stigmatized paranoia gripped the public consciousness. The gutter press operated under a ruthless, speculative algorithm. Any unmarried male celebrity, particularly one who had managed to keep his private life completely obscured from the public record, who died suddenly in his early 50s, was automatically subjected to intense, unfounded scrutiny. The media machinery, which had spent 2 decades aggressively policing his public image and enforcing a heteronormative standard, suddenly pivoted to exploit the long-standing, unconfirmed rumors regarding his sexuality. Publications that had previously ignored his dramatic stage work eagerly published speculative hit pieces. They openly questioned the official cause of death, suggesting that the colon cancer diagnosis was merely a sanitized cover story for AIDS-related complications. It was widely understood in industry circles that publicists routinely falsified death certificates and medical records during this era to protect the commercial legacy of deceased clients from the stigma of the virus. The tabloids weaponized this known industry practice against Little, attempting to retroactively out him and reframe his entire life as a medical scandal. This media frenzy resulted in a brutal posthumous erasure. The focus of his obituary swiftly shifted from his Tony Award-winning talent and his barrier-breaking cinematic achievements to a localized, speculative debate about his sexual orientation and his medical charts. His family and remaining representatives were forced into a defensive posture, compelled to vigorously and publicly deny the AIDS rumors to protect his estate and his historical standing. This defense mechanism, while entirely necessary to combat the invasive tabloids, ironically served to permanently cement the straight illusion that Hollywood had demanded of him throughout his career. The industry's public relations mechanisms worked overtime to sanitize his death, ensuring that his legacy remained palatable to conservative audiences and syndication networks. In the process, the complex, authentic reality of his identity was buried alongside him. The system demanded compliance in life, and it enforced strict conformity in death. The legacy of Cleavon Little is a stark historical document detailing an industry's vast capacity for exploitation. On February 1, 1994, the Hollywood Chamber of Commerce posthumously awarded him a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. The ceremony was a heavily publicized event, complete with industry executives delivering polished speeches, celebrating his comedic genius and his pioneering status for black actors. Yet, analyzed through the forensic lens of his actual lived experience, the brass star embedded in the concrete functions less as a genuine tribute and more as an act of corporate revisionism. It is the final mechanism the system utilized to claim total ownership over his narrative, effectively washing its hands of the psychological damage it inflicted. The tragedy of Cleavon Little is not simply that he died young, but that the machinery of his chosen profession required him to systematically fracture his identity in order to survive. He possessed a generational talent that could command Broadway stages and anchor massive international blockbusters. He possessed the profound intelligence required to navigate the systemic racism of a largely segregated era. But the ultimate price for his entry into the Hollywood elite was the total surrender of his authentic self. He was hired to be a trailblazer, but strictly on the condition that he remained silent about the very real dangerous trails he was forced to walk in the dark. The studios extracted his charisma, weaponized his flawless comedic timing to generate immense wealth, and discarded him when he refused to be confined to their narrow racialized boxes. They built a massive commercial empire on the foundation of his radiant on-screen smile, while aggressively ensuring that the man behind that smile remained entirely isolated. Cleavon Little survived the only way he could, by becoming the ultimate character actor in his own life. The cameras eventually stopped rolling, but the profound, devastating cost of that lifelong performance remains a permanent indictment of the system that demanded it.